What kind of a leader has the right mix of moral clarity, mental toughness, personal discipline, kindness, and grace to lead one of democracy's oldest institutions, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives? And what do you think of when you hear the words Speaker of the House? Do you think of a gavel-wielding power broker? Or perhaps you see the classic wheeler-dealer of a Frank Capra film, holding court in a back room thick with cigar smoke? Well, the man you're about to meet defies more than a few of those stereotypes. His life story, his faith in God, and the long winding road to the speaker's chair are just a few of the reasons that this young emerging leader has drawn the attention and admiration of so many. You'll meet the man and hear his inspirational story of grace up next, so you won't want to miss it. In June of 2020, Representative Bryan Cutler was sworn in as the 139th Speaker of the Pennsylvania House, a famously held position by the body's first Speaker, Benjamin Franklin. In a brief speech to his colleagues given seconds after taking his oath of office and receiving the Speaker's gavel, he quoted from the New Testament book of Galatians. "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." It's a scripture that for Cutler could easily sum up several decades of his own life, defined by difficulty and hardship, a challenge to rely on God's promises to persevere. As a young high school student, his parents were diagnosed with the incurable disease ALS, a condition that ravages the nervous system, weakens muscles, and destroys physical function. As the primary caregiver for his parents, he accepted a role he never expected. It was a defining trial for Bryan, but an opportunity to experience the love and support from his church family and wider community. Bryan and his wife Jennifer have 3 beautiful children and still live in their 11-acre family farm in the same log cabin home where he grew up. Speaker Cutler, welcome to State of Independence. It's an honor to have you joining us from the state capitol, where we know it's been a full work day for you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, this is great. So tell me how it was for you. Here it was as a young man, you were thrust into given the challenge of having to care for your parents when they were diagnosed. And for a young person, for a teenager, that's got to be tough.
Yeah, it was very tough. I'm the oldest of 2 kids. I have a younger sister by 2 years. So I was 15 and she was 13 when this all began. Ironically enough, I had just become saved and accepted Christ as my Savior several months before my mom first became ill. And when she first started having symptoms, she was a nurse. She worked at a doctor's office. Our family doctor and family friend, Dr. Hunt, really took over kind of the management of all of the tests that she would have to undergo, because at that time in the early 90s, Lou Gehrig's disease was it was a diagnosis by exclusion. They would go through everything else, make sure it wasn't something else, and then that was the only thing that was left. And she went through about 6 months of tests, and I remember the day, it was Valentine's Day, when she came home from Johns Hopkins and had been given the diagnosis. And about 8 to 9 months later, my dad also started having symptoms. At first, that was somewhat of an encouragement, because statistically speaking, that would nearly be impossible. Because the individual odds are 1 in a quarter million, and that 2 people that were married that would both come down with the disease was statistically almost impossible. And so they both went through the battery of tests again, and then they ultimately were both diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. And then my father passed away my senior year in high school, and my mom was certainly much more stubborn, as I often joke, with our friends and family. Anybody who knew my mom would know that. She would just live day by day and set a goal for each day. She wanted to see me graduate. She wanted to see my sister graduate. And she miraculously, she lived for almost, I guess it would be about 7.5 years with Lou Gehrig's disease, which at that time, the prognosis was 18 months to 2 years was max. So, it certainly was a blessing to have her much longer than we had anticipated. So I was 15 or 16, just learning how to drive when this all started.
How
And
quickly did they, I mean, after they were diagnosed, how quickly downhill did it go? I mean, I'm guessing they both ended up unable to care for themselves and to use their arms and legs.
Well, Lou Gehrig's disease is very different in terms of how it impacts individuals. My mom was very quick to use a walker, and then ultimately was in a wheelchair within about 9 months or so. My dad, however, even though he was diagnosed later, could still walk up until the day that he passed away. So it was really a different presentation in terms of both, but they both did need personal care needs. We were very fortunate. We worked with our county agencies and volunteers to piece together a schedule for providing their personal care, and we were certainly blessed by our friends and our family. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was also a nurse, so she was there a lot in terms of helping to take care of both of them, and certainly appreciated everybody's interest. Our community did fundraisers, our church did fundraisers, and it was just a really good experience in terms of having individuals minister to us in that way and allow them to help where they could.
Now,
And to
aside
me,
from your grandmother, were there others who encouraged you, who helped you in those difficult days?
there were, I had a distant cousin. We jokingly referred to her as Mama Mundorf. She would always come over, so my sister and I could go to youth group on Wednesday nights or church events, and she would sit with my mom. And then we had wonderful staff. We still stay in contact with some of them. Facebook and other social media platforms have certainly made that easier than back then. But we had an abundance of blessings in terms of our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Our neighbors, the Lions Club, for example, at that time, and we still do, we heat our house with firewood. And on a normal year, you would burn about 6 cords of wood to heat our home. And the Lions Club had showed up, and they cut essentially a 3.5, 4 years supply of wood. They cut, split, and stacked it for my family.
Wow.
And that kind of real world help was just really encouraging, to me as an individual, as well as to me, as being someone early on in my own faith journey.
Yeah, and you still live in that house.
I do.
Yeah.
In 1998, my wife and I purchased it, and we were married in 95, and we lived with my mom for about the first 9 months that we were married until a house up the road went for sale, because we needed to be close enough to supplement and do some of the other household chores like mowing and things. So we were 4 houses up the street. And then after about a year and a half, my mom was to a state where it was very difficult to care for her in home still. And she made the decision she wanted to go to Coreyville Presbyterian Home, which was a long-term care facility that my grandmother actually had worked at. And we moved her in there, and we bought the house at that time. And my wife and I have lived there and raised our own family ever since.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So, do you think, Mr. Speaker, that your challenges, what you had to undergo, the hardships, and some of the suffering that you had to undergo, do you think that's impacted you? It's affected the way you deal with people, certainly with other members of the state house, and maybe even with people who are your political opponents? Do you think it's impacted you in any way?
It certainly has. In terms of how I engage with individuals, I discussed this in my other swearing-in speech at the beginning of this session. I mentioned that everybody has a story. Everybody has a background or a reason why they came. I ultimately decided, I'd had a lifelong dream of going to law school, and because our community and our friends and our family was willing to help my sister and I when we were young and we needed the assistance, I was able to still have a somewhat normal childhood, and because of that, I eventually went to law school, and then I chose to use my law degree to represent the community that was so kind to me early on in my own life. And so that is the reason why I ran for public office. It's the reason that I enjoy helping people in this role. So it absolutely does impact that. And I shared that during my speech, because everybody has a different set of circumstances. Maybe you worked in a family business that was disrupted, or recently shut down by COVID, and some of the pandemic orders that came. Whatever that background is, that informs how you make decisions. And when you understand somebody and understand the process by which they evaluate situations, they understand what might happen. It gives you a better understanding of how they might also solve problems. And once we understand each other, we can respect each other. And once we respect each other, we can find solutions. And I think sharing our stories, sharing our individual walks is an important component of that, because that allows you to get to know individuals as people. They're not somebody else on the other side or an enemy, as is oftentimes painted in today's political world. The truth of the matter is, Pennsylvania is full of a lot of people who want to do well, and they want to help their communities. Where we often differ and where we need to find the solutions is, how do you solve those problems? And those solutions will only be found as we engage in a meaningful discussion about what the actual issues are and how they should be addressed. And we may not always agree on that, and that's okay. But that's why our founding fathers created the system that we have here, with a balance of power between the executive and the legislature and judicial branches. And the legislative process, while it can be frustratingly slow, really is built to ensure that as you vet problems and you vet possible solutions, that there is a consensus that gets a majority of the individuals in both chambers, as well as the governor, on board.
So you are a Christian. You're somebody who accepted Christ into your life, which really changed your life. And now you're elected. You get elected to the House of Representatives, and then as a young man, you become Speaker of the House, which is just a great position to have of responsibility. And yet we find ourselves in perhaps maybe the most contentious time period that certainly one of the most contentious political time periods that we've had in American history. And you find yourself now in this position as a leader in this time of great contention. How do you, realizing that that we'll all eventually answer to God? For elected officials, you have to answer to the voters, of course. And there's the challenge of, how do I make sure my constituency is satisfied? How do I make sure the voters feel good about what I'm doing? But then, ultimately you have to answer to God for your performance here on the planet, for the time that He gave you, especially the time that He gave you in leadership. How do you get that done? I mean, what does a day look like for Speaker Cutler? Does it start with prayer? I mean, tell me how do you get, and then tell me what your hope is. You've already talked so beautifully about hearing other people's stories, but tell us what other hopes you have for bringing people together, if that's at all possible, to move the Commonwealth forward during this contentious time period.
Yeah, I think you highlighted a couple issues, and I'll do my best to run through them. The first is this perception that everybody in Harrisburg or in Washington, D.C. can't work together to find solutions. The good news is that's not true in Harrisburg. Prior to being elected Speaker, I spent about 18 months as Majority Leader. One of the goals of Majority Leader and one of the job functions is to set the legislative calendar. We passed about 648 bills last session, and of those 648 bills, 96% had bipartisan support and 64% were unanimous. That's an important set of statistics, because it does show that we can work together and that the legislative process actually does work to find those solutions that a majority of all Pennsylvanians can support. And I share that because I recognize that it's not widely reported, and it's sad that in today's world, that individuals work together to solve problems isn't a headline. We should be proclaiming that from the mountaintops, because that's ultimately why we are sent here and what the voters expect. In terms of my own day, that's the one thing that ironically has always drawn me to this job. No 2 days are ever the same, and you are able to do a variety of things. You go from doing interviews to doing policy, and that policy is wide ranging. As elected officials in Pennsylvania, we're expected to understand everything from agriculture the whole way up to mining and safety regulations and everything in between. And, I came from a healthcare background. I was originally an X-ray tech. I grew up working on a dairy farm for my neighbor in high school. So though, healthcare and agriculture are two areas where I'm a little more comfortable than some of my colleagues on. The truth of the matter is I'd never been inside a coal mine. I'd never been inside a hydroelectric dam. And this job gives you the opportunity to understand that and then be able to make policy for it.
You've actually milked a cow?
Oh, yes, sir. And I've won a couple of milking contests.
Really?
But I have. But when you look at the component parts of the job, the most important component part is us as elected representatives, and that goes back to, as you mentioned earlier, our stories. What is it that made you want to run? Why are you here? Because whoever you were before is going to be who you are when you're in office. And that's important. So for me, I mentioned my own faith journey, and it's certainly one that's still in progress. Long before I was in a position of leadership as leader or even a speaker, I had undertook a series of devotionals on leadership and wisdom and making wise decisions and understanding the impact of God's word on our lives and what that looks like, because the Bible is full of those stories, and it's a wonderful opportunity to understand how people interact and then how you can make decisions that benefit everybody. And in terms of what that looks like, truthfully, most days it's electronically. I still have my Bible that my parents gave me when I was in high school. In fact, I used that when I was sworn in this most recent session prior to being reelected to the post of speaker. And its margins are full of notes from my teenage years up to today. But the electronic version is a little bit easier to use in terms of availability and always having it with you between meetings and things. But I think that individual faith walk is important. And there's a lot of fellow believers up here in the Capitol. They do morning prayer sessions. They also do Bible studies, which I think are great. Unfortunately, my own schedule typically does not allow me the liberty to attend it, so I have to do that on my own. But we also simply pray for each other and keep each other accountable, and I think that's equally important as well.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you giving us your time. I know how busy you are. I want to ask one last question.
Sure.
We have about a minute and a half maybe or so for this, or 2 minutes. But what would you say to young people, especially to young Christian people who might be inclined, as you were, to run for office, to represent their neighbors in the legislature? What would you say to them? What advice would you give them? Would you encourage them to do it? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Never forget that government is a reflection of the people that send us here. So we might feel like somebody else should do the job. We might feel like maybe we're not prepared. As a young person, I was 31 when I ran the first time, and ultimately won. I heard repeatedly, "Oh, you're too young. You don't know what you're doing. You're a nice young man. Why don't you wait your turn?" The truth of the matter is, I think that it's good to have turnover in the legislature. I think it's good to have a variety of opinions in order to find those solutions that we referenced earlier. But it's also important to have people of faith because you understand the construct by which they make decisions. And we certainly cannot complain about government and the problems with government if we ourselves are not willing to actually go and do the job ourselves. I was raised with 3 pretty simple rules. One is you treat everybody with respect. In terms of Christianity terms, we'd refer to that as the golden rule. And, in terms of elected office and running for office, that was the second one my dad really bestowed upon me, which was you never ask somebody to do something you yourself aren't willing to do. Don't assume it's somebody else's opportunity or somebody else's job. We are all called to that, and we're all called to finally leave this place a better place than we found it. And whether that's here in this institution, our communities where we live, or our individual faith walks, those are the 3 things that should always be our guiding light. And I'd certainly encourage them to do that.
Well, that's great, Mr. Speaker. That's a great word to young people who might be considering doing what it is you've done and done so well. Speaker Bryan Cutler, thank you for being on State of Independence. Thank you for the example of servant leadership you're offering beyond partisanship and certainly beyond this tense moment in our nation's history. I'll ask our audience members to continue to lift you and your family up in prayer as you continue this journey. It was an honor to have you on the program today, and can't wait to have you back.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
You're watching Joe Watkins' State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Share your comments about today's program in the comment box at joewatkins.org.
And now we'll talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Well,
Jeff, now, you served in the State House. I mean, people
Yeah.
may not know that about you, so you know this world.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Bryan Cutler is he is very different from the model of kind of a traditional speaker. Now, and I say that with respect to all the others that have served before him. He just has a very different approach, and he doesn't necessarily look or act like a powerful speaker of the House of Representatives. One of the weapons that a speaker can wield is intimidation.
Right.
It is in some cases size, being big, overpowering, domineering men. Other times it's their reputation on the House floor as tacticians and being able to cut you down to size with your words. Here comes Bryan. I mean, no show, very authentic, no sarcasm. And you remember how he started the program, talking about how he came to Christ in a relationship with Jesus in the middle of a big trial. To me, it kind of defines servant leadership.
Yeah, very, very different story from most. I mean,
what did you think?
Well, I just would think that I was pleasantly surprised because clearly his character is one where he's seeking to put Christ first, and a lot of the Christ-like attributes seem to be present in his life. Kindness, patience. I liked when he was talking about bringing people together, hearing people's stories. A lot of people in politics are self-consumed. They care about themselves. They're all about me. They don't have time to hear about you. They don't want to know who you are. They want to tell you who they are.
Yeah.
And here's a guy who's saying, I really want to hear
Right.
somebody's story, what they've been through, because that really tells me a lot about them.
I don't know if you noticed that when you would ask a question, he would listen to all of it and then answer all of the pieces of it.
Yeah.
One of the things that you and I have been around many politicians and have given political speeches before, and you kind of stay with the topic that you want to talk about,
That's right.
no matter what the question comes in. When a person actually answers the question and they actually hear you, that's a pretty refreshing thing.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you just a broad question about servant leaders. And you have observed both kinds of leaders, the big, strong personality, glad-hander, great at retail politics. And then you see someone like a Bryan Cutler. There's a tension there to what people want. Some people want to get things done, and this goes back to the founding. Where does a servant leader fit in? Where does someone who wants to serve like Christ fit in when politics demands that you have sharp elbows and you go in and fight for your place, especially in a place like a legislature?
Yeah. I think it's just realizing who you serve first, whose you are. You were bought with a price, and Jesus paid that price on the cross, and you follow him. And you're not him, you're not Jesus, but you follow Jesus. And so the challenge is for his spirit to be seen in you by how you operate every day, wherever it is you may be. And that's true for people who are in the legislature as well. It's true for everybody. Everybody watching has the same challenge to love the Lord and then to serve him by following him, by being a doer of the word and not just a hearer only. In the legislature, it becomes tough because just like in ministry, people are looking up to you. You're on a pedestal, so to speak. People are looking up to you, and then you have the additional challenge, unlike ministry, of they've got to vote for you to retain your spot. So where do you? That's part of what I was trying to get at. There's the instinct to be man and woman pleasing, human pleasing, and to do what will please human beings. And then there's what's the right thing to do? How do I serve God? How do I answer to him? How do I stand in that day of judgment when my life ends and say, Lord, and have him say back to me, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. And that's the challenge. How do you do that? When the climate is such where you have to take sides. Are you for? Are you against? Whose side are you on? Who are you with? because that's how people judge you.
Right.
They ask questions like that, like, well, do you support so-and-so? Are you against so-and-so? Are you with us? Are you against us?
And it's almost as if they're asking, what kind of a person are you?
Right.
But if we didn't stop to have this program today, we wouldn't know, as the speaker said, everybody has a story. We wouldn't know that in high school he faced this extraordinary life challenge. We wouldn't know his spiritual journey. We wouldn't know what he did to survive. The milking contest was kind of you think of somebody at the Speaker's Rostrum, and in the Pennsylvania House is a really grand palace of a place, and you're sitting in this chair, leaning back, looking up at all of this. It's a palace of art, and then the Speaker stands at this rostrum, and he has this magnificent, giant painting behind him of all the luminaries who have served in this body and who have been instrumental in leading the state. And to think of him talking about milking cows and chopping wood, and not to do it in a way to say I grew up in a log cabin, but he literally did. So I don't know. I was very encouraged.
Well, you were there. You served.
Yeah. I've never milked a cow. No. Actually, wait a second. I did. I think a farmer did take me out, and I did have to milk a cow, I think, one time. Not for a living.
But how do you, in that grand environment, heady environment, it's heady stuff.
Yeah.
You get elected by your neighbors to serve, and then you go to the legislature, and you're in the Capitol building, which is this marvelous building, and you're in this chamber with these other folks who've been elected like you, but you're one of a few. You're one of a selected few, and how do you? The part about how do you keep the blinders on? Like have you ever seen those horses that had the blinders on so they don't get distracted? How do you not get distracted? How do you not lose focus of why you're there, of what you've been gifted to do when you're in that environment with all that excess, with the art, with the history,
And people saying, don't pick that up, Representative. I have that, Representative. Let me take care of that for you. I think the hardest part for me, and I know for most people who follow Christ in the legislature, is time. It is how do you stay calm and balanced and maintain a perspective so that you have time to pray, or you have time to connect deeply with people, not on a political level. That's very, very hard to do, but it can be done, as the Speaker's proven.
Yeah. Well, what kinds of leaders do we want to hold public office? What are the attributes of a follower of Jesus Christ in the public square? How do we measure the effectiveness of leaders? Is it solely by their accomplishments, or is it by their character? No politician is perfect. None of us can truly claim to be role models, but if the example of perfect leadership is the one offered by Christ in the New Testament, it seems to me that this is a model worth studying. And when we see hints of that kind of servant leadership, we should encourage and praise it. Well, sadly, that's all the time we have for today's State of Independence. You can catch us on past episodes with other leaders in the realm of public service and many and other kinds of ministry at joewatkins.org. Every episode is available for free on our YouTube channel. So please send me a comment about today's program in the comment box on our website, because I read every single one of them. It's our hope that this program encourages you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. From America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week.
Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.